Hi, I'm Darren Decker, and this is Herb Brooks. We're back talking about troubleshooting gas chromatography.
So far, we've covered baseline noise and disturbances, fronting peaks and ghost peaks.
Bonus peaks.
Yeah, right. Now we're going to cover tailing peaks.
Tailing peaks, tailing peaks. Where do we begin? I mean, there are many things that cause tailing peaks.
The first thing I would ask the customer is, when was the last time you performed inlet maintenance? The most common source of the problem resides in the inlet. If the peak looks good, but starts to degrade and worsens over time, this is a classic front-end problem resulting from sample load.
If it happens suddenly, it may be that one or two particular dirty samples were injected, which accelerated the problem. Non-volatile contamination will build up and accumulate over time in the column, which can cause retention time shifts and/or peak tailing. Semi-volatile contamination can ooze down the column and basically coat the column, causing the same issues.
So, we'll start off with basic inlet maintenance, including trimming 10 to 20 centimeters off the front end of the column.
You could solvent rinse the column too, but we rarely see people do this as a standard practice since it's so time-consuming. Obviously, keeping the contamination from ever making it to the inlet or the column, that would be ideal. Using additional cleanup steps to prepare your sample, solid phase extraction, filtration, they might help, but of course that takes additional time and more method development. But if successful, this will definitely extend your column life. You can also try using a guard column. The guard column provides a place for the contamination to deposit and keeps the contaminants off the analytical column. You can also try a different liner with glass wool placed towards the bottom. Here's a picture that shows you what the glass wool in your inlet liner does. Contamination is caught in the glass wool and stays out of your GC system. This will help to trap any non-volatile contamination prior to even getting on the column. Sadly, it won't stop the semi-volatile contamination. Only baking out the column will remove that.
If you haven't performed routine GC maintenance recently, clean the injector, replace the liner, replace the gold seal and septa. You'll want to follow the procedure that I demonstrated earlier.
Once you've eliminated inlet contamination, but peak tailing persists, you should think about activity on the column. If you're analyzing active compounds, they may be clinging to active sites on your column. Again, if this is just contamination or damage to the front of the column, you can trim that portion off. Let me show you how to do that. We simply take the column, hold it in one hand, and for just ease of purposes, I'm holding it out in front of you just a section, and then I take my ceramic wafer. There's a rough side and a smooth side as you feel the edges of your ceramic wafer. Take the smooth side and just score the column to go through the polyimide and just nick the glass. It shouldn't break at this point, but at that point you should be able to apply a little stress to the column. It should break easily, and then you can remove it. If it is further down than that and subsequent trimming shows no improvement, then the entire column may be active. Unfortunately, this problem is irreversible. You'll need to replace your column. If you routinely analyze active compounds, you'll want to consider using an ultra-inert column. These columns are designed to give the best possible inertness available for active compounds. They can still become active with use, but you're starting with the most inertness available in the column. The other thing to know is that some active compounds will always tail. That's just the way it is. The ultra-inert column may help with this, but some compounds, there's just nothing you can do. We have had some analysts use a passivation, or as some people say, priming step, where they take a high concentration of an active compound, say an amine or an organic acid, depending on what they're working with, and inject it several times prior to the routine analysis in hopes of passivating the column towards the particular active compound. This has shown some effectiveness, but not necessarily in all cases. Another reason you might see peak tailing is because of a flow path issue. If there's an excessive dead volume or some sort of obstruction or poor installation, even severe column contamination, that can act as a flow path problem and give us peak tailing. The reason for that is because there's some sort of column obstruction, turbulent flow. The compound of interest has to make it around that obstruction, which causes the peak to tail. A good way to look for that is to inject something that you know has no activity whatsoever and is fairly volatile so that it spends most of its time in the flow path, such as methane or butane. Methane or butane gas should have no tail at all. If you have any tailing on something like that, then you know you have some sort of obstruction or flow path problem. The other thing to look at, and we see this is a consistent trend with a lot of these chromatographic issues, is that the column may not be installed properly. If we create a turbulent flow by doing a poor installation, this will generally show up as peak tailing. Getting a clean cut, getting the right distance of the column into the inlet and the detector, getting everything leak-free, all play a role in proper installation. If we have too much column up in the inlet, we create dead volume. If we have too little column up in the inlet, the column is down in the hole of the gold seal, and turbulent flow is in that area. So too low or too high is not good. 4 to 6 millimeters above the ferrule is recommended for the distance on the inlet side. On the detector side, it varies, but the idea is to put the column right up to the detection zone without creating any dead volume. Any poor cutting of the column can create turbulent flow as well. Leaks have the same effect, as well as any obstructions. Septa chunks, non-volatile goo in the glass wool, overstuffed glass wool, the list goes on and on. I like to think of it as if you were to drop a rock into a nice flowing stream, what would you see right behind that rock? A turbulent, gushing flow. That's what's happening to your sample. Some peak tailing comes from polarity mismatches in solute and solvent and the stationary phase. Remember, like dissolves like, and oil and water don't mix. Well, if solubility is a problem, you'll have peak shape problems. If your solvent or solute isn't very soluble in the stationary phase, this alone can cause peak shape problems, and often tailing is how it presents itself. The only real way to relieve this is to pick a different column phase or solvent, but unless it is a real issue, most analysts just endure the peak shape distortion. But if you're getting more tailing or peak distortion in only those peaks closest to the solvent front or major component peak, that issue is something we call the reverse solvent effect, and we've talked about this already. The compounds eluting around that major component or solvent are competing with being with the solvent and being in the stationary phase. A kind of tug-of-war is happening in the column. This is where putting a 3 to 5 meter of retention gap or guard column, an uncoated fused silica tube column, usually helps alleviate this issue. Here's an example of a retention gap. This would be an extremely short one. Usually we use 2 to 3 meters, and we also refer to this as a guard column. Let's look at our new chromatogram after using the retention gap. You can see that we've really improved the analysis a lot. There's minimal tailing and peak distortion on those peaks coming around that solvent. In a splitless or on-column injection, if you see peak tailing decreasing with retention, you may be getting a solvent effect violation. You can address this by decreasing the initial column temperature to get a better focusing effect of the solvent. Usually 10 to 20 degrees Celsius below the boiling point of the solvent is sufficient for a good focusing effect. In our chromatogram here, we're using hexane, which has a boiling point of 69 degrees, and if we start the oven at 70, we obviously get a poor focusing effect of the early looking peaks. But at 50 degrees Celsius, we get good focusing. In this case, the tailing isn't a real issue, as it will be in other cases, but the peak broadening is very obvious.
In a split injection, you'll want a minimum of 20 mils a minute of total flow through the inlet, and 30 mils a minute is even better. If it's slower, that'll tend to contribute to peak tailing, as this example shows. Note the loss of the peak shape of the first two analytes in the chromatogram. Here, the split ratio is too low, and the flow rate in the inlet is no longer high enough to maintain an efficient sample introduction. Column flow rate in this example is about 1 mil a minute. A split ratio of 5 to 1 will produce a total flow in the inlet of only about 6 mils a minute. Plus, add the 3 mils a minute out of the septum purge. Here, the sample transfer is taking too long, and the more volatile components are beginning to move down the column during the time it takes to transfer. This is where the peak tailing comes from. Later eluting compounds exhibit good peak shape because they focus better on the front end of the column and do not move during the time it takes to transfer the sample.
Now you can easily fix that by increasing the split vent flow, which does increase the split ratio, so you'll have to make sure you still have the sensitivity you need for your analysis. Here's the new chromatogram to demonstrate the improvement.
I'd say that covers the major issue with peak tailing. Let's summarize. If you've got a peak tailing issue, did it start suddenly? If so, it's probably a contamination issue in the inlet due to dirty samples. Do basic inlet maintenance, replace the liner, the O-ring, septa, possibly the gold seal. Then, think about sample prep or filtration to prevent the issues from reoccurring again. Next, look at the column activity. Trimming the column usually solves this issue. But if not, it's time to replace the column. Next, check your column for blockage. This can be done by injecting hexane or butane. These compounds shouldn't tail at all. If they do tail, you know you have a blockage. Then reinstall your column. Look at your solvent for a polarity mismatch or a reverse solvent effect. If you're seeing peak tailing decrease with retention, consider solvent effect violation. Decreasing your initial column temperature by 10 to 20 degrees below the boiling point of the solvent should address this issue. And finally, look at your split ratio. Is it too low? I think that covers it, Darren.
I sure hope so. Let's move on to our next common troubleshooting issue, split peaks.